Cold wind scraped over stone blocks in Egypt, while, far to the north, mammoths were still pressing their wide feet into frozen ground. That is the first fact that should stop you. The Great Pyramid of Giza belongs to a world we call ancient, and yet the true end of these giants came later. Most of us carry a simple picture in our heads. Ice Age ends, giant beasts vanish, curtain falls. Clean, distant, finished. But woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna do not give us that comfort. The timeline refuses to sit still. These animals were not erased in one neat prehistoric moment. Some populations were gone much earlier. Some endured. And the last survivors lived in a world that was already old enough to build monuments from stone. That changes the feeling of the story, doesn't it? It is no longer just about deep prehistory. It becomes a delayed catastrophe. To understand that catastrophe, you have to picture the lost world they belonged to. Their kingdom was the mammoth steppe, not endless blank ice or a white desert with nothing to eat, but a cold grassland, open, windy, and rich in the kind of plants huge grazing animals could live on. For a very long time, that land held together. Then, as the glaciers pulled back around 11,700 years ago, the ground itself began to change. Grassland gave way, little by little, to tundra and forest. The old feeding world started closing. And when a world changes, it does not only trouble one creature. In North America, around the time we connect with the Clovis era, mammoths disappeared. But they did not vanish alone. Mastodons went. Giant ground sloths went. Saber-toothed cats went. Different bodies, different habits, different lives. And yet they all fade from the record in roughly the same great window of loss, between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago. So what do we do with that? One answer says the warming world broke the system. Another says people arrived with skill, patience, and enough pressure to tip slow-breeding giants into decline, what later came to be called the overkill hypothesis. Another possibility whispers of disease. And the hardest answer of all is this. Maybe no single cause gets to carry the blame alone. That is where this mystery begins. With a question sharp enough to survive into our own age. If some of them outlived the pyramids, then what kind of ending was this really? If you like long-form mysteries like this, subscribe now, because the next step takes us into the lost grasslands, where the ending may have started long before the last survivor fell silent. So let's stay there for a moment, in that vanished grassland, because the shape of that place matters more than it first seems. The air would not have felt soft. It would have bitten at the face, carried dry cold in long gusts, and moved over open ground where grass, not dense forest, ruled the horizon. This was open grassland, broad, exposed, and built for heavy grazers. That detail changes everything. These giants were not creatures clinging to the edge of survival in a frozen waste. They were fitted to a working world. Their bodies, their movement, their feeding, all of it belonged to that wide belt of cold grass. And when people hear that, a strange assumption often slips in. If the animals were so well adapted, then surely they should have survived the warming. But adaptation is not magic. It ties a creature to a certain kind of world, and when that world changes fast enough, the strength that once protected it can become a kind of trap. As the glaciers retreated around 11,700 years ago, the land did not simply get warmer in some gentle, friendly way. The ground changed character. Open feeding country began turning into tundra and forest. The old visibility of the steppe narrowed. The menu changed. The routes changed. The silence of open wind gave way, in many places, to brush, damp soil, and trees. That is the first hard truth in this reconstruction. Extinction does not always begin with bodies. Sometimes it begins with grass disappearing under new plants. Sometimes it begins when a giant animal must walk farther for the same mouthful. Sometimes it begins when a landscape stops behaving like home. Now hold that thought beside another fact, because this is where the story darkens. In North America, between about 13,000 and 11,000 years ago, not just one kind of giant faded away. Mammoths did. Mastodons did. Giant ground sloths did. Saber-toothed cats did. Different animals, different ways of living, but a shared age of loss, close to the Clovis era. You can feel the pressure of that pattern. One disappearance can be explained away. A whole company of giants slipping out of the world together is harder to dismiss. So the question sharpens. If the land was transforming under their feet, was that enough by itself? Or did the warming only weaken the old order, just in time for another force to arrive and make the damage permanent? Because once human hunters enter this picture, the mystery stops being only about climate and becomes something far more uncomfortable. And that is the uncomfortable turn in the story, because the moment people step into this fading landscape, the question changes its moral weight. A cold plain can shrink on its own. Grass can give way to brush without any human hand touching it. That idea lets us keep a certain kind of innocence. The climate changed. The world shifted. The giants could not adjust quickly enough. Tragic, but impersonal. Then the other possibility enters the room, and the air feels different. If human hunting mattered, even a little, then woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna are not just a story about weather and time. They become, in part, a story about us. Now, notice something important. The overkill hypothesis does not need wild scenes or endless pursuit to be dangerous. In fact, its force comes from something quieter. These were huge animals, yes, but they were not built for rapid replacement. A creature that grows slowly, reproduces slowly, and depends on stable habitat does not need to be hunted in vast numbers to begin losing ground. Pressure can be light, repeated, and still become fatal over generations. A few losses here, a few more there. Arithmetic. That is what makes this idea so chilling. You do not need to imagine some dramatic final campaign against the giants. You only need to imagine a world already thinning around them. Feeding grounds breaking apart, roots becoming less reliable, groups becoming more isolated. Then into that strained world comes a clever, organized hunter. Patient, adaptive, mobile. Suddenly, a population that looked large in the open air may not have been secure at all. But here the mystery refuses to become simple. Because if hunting explains everything, then why did different species vanish in different ways? Why do we face this broad pattern rather than one neat line of evidence? Mammoths disappeared, yes, but so did mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats in that same broad age of loss. Their lives were not identical. Their habitats were not identical. Their vulnerabilities were not identical. So a single clean answer begins to feel too clean. This is where catastrophe reconstruction becomes harder than people expect. One explanation preserves ecological complexity but softens human guilt. Another centers human action but risks flattening the environment into background scenery. And the truth may be crueler than either comfort. It may be that warming weakened the old world first, and hunting arrived not as the sole executioner, but as the force that made recovery impossible. If that is true, then the giants were cornered by timing. And once you start thinking in those terms, one more possibility begins to creep in from the edges. What if climate and hunting were still not the whole story? And that is where the third shadow enters the frame. If warming changed the land and human pressure reduced the margin for recovery, there is still another possibility that refuses to go away: disease. We do not have some neat, dramatic record of a plague sweeping through the Ice Age, and this matters. We need to keep fact and speculation separate. The fact is simple. Scientists still debate whether disease played a role in the extinction of these giants, alongside climate, hunting, or both. The speculation is the size of that role. Still, once you picture their world breaking into smaller pockets, the idea becomes harder to dismiss. Imagine a herd moving through cold air that no longer smells the way it used to. Less open grass, more wet ground, more barriers, fewer easy paths. Groups that once belonged to a broad, connected world are now cut into pieces. And small, stressed populations are different from large, stable ones. They do not have the same buffer. They do not have the same room for bad luck. One problem that a great population might absorb can hit a reduced one much harder. So disease stays on the table. Not because it is proven as the main answer, but because extinction is often cruel in exactly this way. One pressure makes another pressure more dangerous. A shrinking habitat may not end a species by itself. Hunting may not erase every last population on its own, but add strain, isolation, and weakening condition, and suddenly an illness does not need to be spectacular to matter. It only needs to arrive at the wrong time. You can feel the emotional temptation here, can't you? People want one clean cause, one villain, one sentence that closes the case. Climate did it. Humans did it. Disease did it. But the more honestly we look at woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna, the less likely that tidy answer becomes. The real story may be uglier than that. Several forces, each incomplete on its own, may have locked together. And if that is true, then the extinction was not a single blow. It was a tightening circle. That matters especially when we return to North America, because the vanished animals there were not copies of each other. Mammoths were not mastodons. Giant ground sloths were not saber-toothed cats. If so many different creatures disappeared in roughly the same era, then any explanation that is too narrow starts to crack. One species might fall to one weakness. A whole age of giants falling together suggests something larger, something layered. So now the paradox sharpens again. If the mainland was becoming a trap built from many causes at once, why did some mammoths survive so much longer in isolation, almost as if the world had forgotten them? That delayed survival is one of the strangest parts of the whole case, because it forces us to stop thinking in one straight line. If the mainland had become unstable through warming, habitat change, hunting pressure, disease, or some blend of all three, then survival in isolation starts to look less like victory and more like postponement. A small surviving population can fool the eye. From far away, it looks like proof that the species was still doing fine. But that is not what a refuge always means. Sometimes a refuge is only the last room in a burning house. This is where the late survivors matter so much. The fact that mammoths outlived the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza is not a cute historical surprise. It is a warning about timing. A species can remain alive long after the larger system that once supported it has already fallen apart. That gap between ecological collapse and final disappearance is where so much confusion begins. People hear that some mammoths were still alive much later, and they assume the danger must have been exaggerated earlier. But late survival does not erase earlier damage. It may reveal it. Try to picture what that means in practice. The old open world is mostly gone. The vast grazing network has broken. Large connected populations have thinned out. Yet somewhere at the edge of the map, a small group remains. Cold air still moves there. Some food still holds. The place still resembles the lost world just enough to buy time, not safety. That is why woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna resist simple storytelling. Extinction is not always a clean drop from abundance to nothing. It can come in steps. First, a species loses range. Then it loses connection between groups. Then it loses resilience. Only at the end does it lose its final bodies. By the time the last survivors are standing on the landscape, the real disaster may already be years, centuries, even millennia behind them. And once you accept that, another, darker possibility opens. What if those late herds were carrying damage no one could see from the outside? What if the danger was no longer only in the sky, the grass, or the presence of human hunters? What if it had already moved inward, into fertility, into health, into the silent arithmetic of a population too small to stay whole? Because when a species is reduced to a remnant, survival itself can begin to change shape. And on one remote island, that hidden change may have left marks deeper than bone. That hidden damage is what turns the story from a broad ecological mystery into something far more intimate. A species can lose land and still go on for a while. It can survive thinner grazing, broken roots, colder winters in one place, and wetter ground in another. It can even survive human pressure longer than we might expect. But when a population becomes very small, another danger begins to grow in silence, inside the population itself. This is where the last island survivors become so important. The final herd on Wrangel Island was not just a leftover group living in a remote refuge. It was a test case, a remnant, a thin, surviving thread of a much larger world. And when scientists studied genomes from those last mammoths, they found something grim: severe inbreeding and a buildup of harmful mutations. In plain language, the herd had begun to carry more and more biological damage because there were too few animals left for too long in too small a pool. That phrase, genomic meltdown, sounds technical, but the reality behind it is brutally simple. When a population shrinks enough, it starts losing options. Close relatives are more likely to breed. Harmful mutations that might once have been diluted or removed begin to linger. Over time, the population may still look alive from the outside, bodies moving, feeding, enduring the cold, while its ability to remain healthy weakens generation after generation. And that changes the emotional meaning of late survival. The Wrangel Island remnant herd was not proof that the old order had recovered. It may have been proof that collapse can hide inside survival. A species does not need to vanish from the landscape in one dramatic moment to be in mortal trouble. It can remain visible while becoming less resilient, less fertile, less stable. The final chapter can begin long before the final disappearance. Now, notice how this complicates everything we have already talked about. If warming broke apart the mammoth steppe, that could have isolated small groups. If hunting added pressure, that could have reduced numbers further. If disease ever entered the picture, even in a limited way, a weakened population would have had less room to absorb it. And once the herd was small enough, the damage no longer needed to come only from outside. The trap could close from within. That is why the mammoth story is so hard to reduce to one cause. Climate may have opened the wound. Human pressure may have deepened it. Isolation may have kept it from healing. And in the final survivors, the cost may have been written into the genes themselves. But that raises a colder question still. If the last herd was already carrying this hidden burden, then were the final mammoths doomed only at the end? Or had the real extinction begun much earlier, back when the mainland still seemed full? That question matters more than it seems, because it forces us to separate the visible end from the real beginning of collapse. When people imagine extinction, they tend to imagine the last few animals, the final herd, the final season, the final quiet disappearance. But for these giants, the decisive moment may have come much earlier, back when there were still enough bodies on the land to make the world look full. That is one of the hardest lessons in this whole reconstruction. Abundance can hide weakness. A species can seem present everywhere and still be sliding toward an outcome it no longer has the strength to avoid. Think about what had already been lost by then. The mammoth steppe had begun to break apart. Open grassland was giving way to other kinds of ground. In North America, the wider company of Ice Age megafauna was already thinning across that long window near the Clovis era. If the landscape was fragmenting and populations were becoming more isolated, then the damage did not need to wait for the final island survivors. It could have started much sooner, in quieter ways. First, range shrinks. Then, contact between groups becomes less reliable. Then, numbers fall in places where recovery once would have been easy. And once those connections weaken, every new pressure lands harder. Hunting strikes a fractured one, not a strong, endless population anymore. Disease, if it entered at all, reaches smaller, more vulnerable groups, not a robust network. Harmful mutations do not build in a vast, connected species the same way they build in isolated pockets. The process changes shape long before the ending becomes obvious. This is why the final island chapter is so haunting. The genomic meltdown seen in that remnant does not stand apart from the rest of the story. It may be the late echo of damage already set in motion on the mainland. In that sense, the Wrangel Island remnant herd was not the first place the disaster happened. It was simply the last place where its consequences became impossible to miss. And there is a cruel irony here. The very thing that allowed some mammoths to survive longer, isolation, may also have carried the seed of their final weakness. Distance bought them time. It may also have cut them off from the genetic breadth that larger populations need. A refuge can protect bodies while starving a lineage of future options. So now the timeline looks different, not like a sudden fall, but like a long unraveling. The last survivors were not standing at the start of the tragedy. They were standing at its far end. Which means the next question is even darker. If extinction can begin while a species still looks alive and widespread, then how do you tell the difference between survival and delay? That distinction between survival and delay is where this story becomes especially deceptive. From a distance, a late population can look like evidence of strength. You hear that some of these animals endured long after the mainland losses, and the mind wants to turn that into a victory. Maybe the danger was overstated. Maybe the extinction was never as severe as it sounds. But that is exactly the trap. A small surviving group does not always mean recovery. Sometimes it means the larger collapse has already happened, and only a fragment is still moving through the cold. You can think of it like an echo in a huge empty place. The sound is real, you hear it, but what created it may already be gone. That is why the last survivors matter so much in woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna. They force us to ask a harder question than, when did the species end? We have to ask, when did the species stop having a real future? Those are not the same moment. A creature can remain on the land while the conditions that once allowed it to thrive have already been broken beyond repair. And once you start seeing the problem that way, the old search for one dramatic ending begins to feel almost childish. The world of the mammoth steppe did not simply switch off in one afternoon. It thinned, shifted, narrowed. The broad, connected spaces that had supported great numbers no longer behaved the same way. The surviving groups became more like scattered islands, even before some of them reached actual islands. In that kind of world, the last herd is not standing inside the old abundance. It is standing after the loss of abundance, even if a few bodies remain. This is also why the debate over causes remains so alive. Climate change explains the breaking of the old habitat. The overkill hypothesis explains how human hunting could hit a stressed population harder than it would hit a vast, secure one. Disease remains possible precisely because smaller, more isolated groups are less buffered against bad turns. And then, in the final remnant, the hidden weakness inside the population begins to matter too. None of these pressures needs to act alone to be dangerous. In fact, the deeper horror may be that each explanation becomes more convincing when placed beside the others. Warming makes hunting more costly. Hunting makes isolation more damaging. Isolation makes biological weakness harder to escape. A species can survive each problem for a while and still lose to all of them together. So by the time a remnant herd appears to us as a miracle, it may already be something else entirely. Not a comeback, a refuge no longer, but the last visible proof of a disaster that had been unfolding quietly for far longer than anyone standing there could have known. And once we accept that, one place on the edge of the Arctic stops looking like a sanctuary and starts looking like a final test. That final test begins with a place that seems, at first, almost merciful. Far out in the Arctic, where the wind cuts hard across dark water and the ground stays spare and exposed, Wrangel Island offered something the mainland was losing: distance. Distance from the broken routes, distance from the wider ecological collapse. Possibly distance, at least for a time, from some of the pressures that had been closing in elsewhere. And so the island matters so much. It was not just another point on a map. It was a delayed chamber in the story, a place where the old world echoed a little longer. You can feel the temptation to call that survival a triumph, a hidden refuge, a last fortress. But listen carefully to what that really means. The very fact that a remnant endured there suggests that conditions on the mainland had already become too unstable to hold the larger populations together. The island did not erase the catastrophe. It may have exposed its shape. If only a remote pocket remained, then the broader living system that once supported these animals had already narrowed beyond recognition. So Wrangel Island forces a cruel question. When a species survives only in isolation, is that evidence of resilience or evidence that everything else has already failed? This is where woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna become almost unbearable in their logic. The same separation that may have protected those survivors also limited them. No broad exchange with other groups, no easy refill of lost diversity, no return to the full scale of the mammoth steppe, just a smaller stage, harsher in its own way, holding on after the main drama had already ended elsewhere. And yet, they endured. Long enough to overturn our comfortable timeline. Long enough for the pyramids to begin to rise in Egypt. long enough to make extinction seem less like a single ancient event and more like a layered unraveling, with a final afterimage at the world's edge. That matters because the island gives us a controlled glimpse of the end. On the mainland, too many forces overlap at once: warming, shrinking habitat, hunting, maybe disease, fragmentation. But in an isolated remnant, one more variable becomes easier to see. What happens when numbers stay low for too long? What happens when a herd survives physically but cannot renew itself cleanly across generations? On that lonely ground, with sea wind moving over the last of their tracks, the question stops being abstract. Because the island did preserve them for a while, but it may also have trapped them in the very condition that would make their ending irreversible. That irreversibility is the key, because once you reach it, the meaning of survival changes again. A healthy population survives by renewing itself. It replaces losses. It keeps enough variety inside itself to stay flexible when weather shifts, food changes, or bad luck strikes. But a trapped remnant survives differently. It endures from one season to the next without rebuilding the larger strength it once had. From the outside, that difference can be invisible. You still have living animals. You still have tracks in the frost, breath in the cold air, bodies moving across the ground. Yet underneath that visible life, the future may already be thinning. This makes the Wrangel Island remnant herd so haunting. The genomes from those last survivors do not just tell us that they were few. They tell us that being few had consequences. Severe inbreeding, harmful mutations building up, a population carrying more internal weakness than a larger, connected one could afford. That is not just bad luck. It is a structural problem. Once numbers remain too low for too long, the damage begins to accumulate in ways that time alone does not heal. And now, the island takes on a more disturbing shape. It was a refuge, yes, but only in the narrow sense that it allowed them to remain alive. It was not a return to the old abundance of the mammoth steppe. It was not a reopening of lost connections. It was not rescue in the full sense of the word. The same sea barrier that protected the herd from some outside pressures also sealed it inside a smaller genetic world. Protection and confinement became the same thing. That should make you pause, because it means the end may not have required one final dramatic event at all. Maybe there was no single last blow that explains everything. Maybe by the time the herd reached that condition, the decisive damage had already been done by accumulation. Habitat loss, narrowing the stage, numbers falling, isolation deepening. Then the slow inward pressure of a genomic meltdown, making recovery harder with every generation. In that kind of scenario, extinction does not arrive like a door slamming. It arrives like a bridge, weakening one plank at a time, until one day there is no safe crossing left. And that thought loops us back to the mainland in a new way. Because if the last survivors carried visible genetic scars, then the earlier populations might also have been more vulnerable than they appeared. Not yet in the same condition, perhaps, but already on the road toward it once fragmentation had begun. So the mystery shifts again. The question is no longer only what killed the mammoths. Now it becomes, at what point did the system stop being able to save them at all? That loss of rescue makes the whole extinction feel less like an accident and more like a closing mechanism. At first, a species still has ways to recover. If one valley turns poor, another may still feed it. If one herd declines, others may still carry enough strength to refill the gap. If one season goes badly, the wider system absorbs the blow. But once the old range breaks apart, those safety nets start disappearing. Recovery no longer belongs to the species as a whole. It depends on fragments, and fragments are fragile. That is why the mainland matters just as much as the island. The late survivors on Wrangel Island show us what small numbers can do over time. But the road toward that condition was likely laid much earlier, when the larger world stopped functioning as one connected body. The mammoth steppe had once spread wide enough to support movement, exchange, and resilience. When that world turned into tundra and forest in many places, the animals did not simply lose scenery. They lost the living structure that made comeback possible. And once that structure is gone, every explanation becomes sharper. Climate is no longer just background weather. It becomes the force that tears open the first gap. The overkill hypothesis is no longer a claim that humans had to erase great herds in one sweep. It becomes a question of added pressure on a system already weakened. Disease, even if it played only a partial role, becomes more dangerous because the population is no longer broad and buffered. Then, in the final remnant, the inward damage begins to show, steadily enough that survival starts looking like a body carrying too much hidden strain. That is the darker version of this story, a sequence of losses that remove the options one by one. First, the landscape stops giving what it once gave. Then, numbers stop recovering the way they once recovered. Then, separation becomes normal. Then, even endurance starts to betray the species, because lasting a little longer in isolation can deepen the weakness instead of curing it. If that sounds cruel, it is. But deep time often is. Catastrophe does not owe us a dramatic ending. Sometimes it works through subtraction. Take away range, take away connection, take away resilience. Leave the bodies standing for a while longer, and from a distance, it still looks as if the species is alive in the old sense. But it isn't, not really. It is surviving on reduced terms. So when we ask what ended these giants, we may be asking the question too late. Because by the time the final herd remained, the more important question may already have shifted to something colder. When did their survival stop meaning recovery and start meaning only postponement? That word, postponement, might be the coldest word in this entire story, because it strips away the romance of the last survivors. We like to imagine the end of a species as a final stand, something noble and dramatic against a dark horizon. But what if the truth is less theatrical than that? What if those last herds were not holding the line in any meaningful sense at all? What if they were simply continuing, year by year, inside a system that no longer had the power to restore them? In that case, the final centuries were not a comeback. They were a delay between damage and disappearance. Once you see it that way, the old debate changes shape again. Climate no longer looks like a rival explanation to human hunting so much as the force that may have narrowed the field first. The overkill hypothesis no longer needs to explain a healthy and abundant world being erased from scratch. It only has to ask what repeated human pressure does to an already stressed population. Disease, if it entered the picture at all, becomes more dangerous in the same reduced setting. And the genomic meltdown in the last island herd no longer looks like an isolated tragedy. It begins to look like the final biological expression of a long ecological collapse. That matters because it means extinction can be real long before the last body is gone. A species may still breathe, feed, migrate in shorter ways, raise young now and then, and still have crossed an invisible line. Beyond that line, each generation is not rebuilding strength. It is spending what remains. The living world around it may still contain that animal, but the deeper machinery that once made its future possible has broken. The engines of recovery are gone. Only momentum remains. And momentum can be deceptive. It is why the late mammoths feel so haunting to us. They survived long enough to stand almost within reach of written history, enough to trick our instincts into thinking they must still have had a chance. But survival in time is not the same as survival in possibility. A lineage can last after its real options have run out. That is the part most people miss. So, when we picture those last animals on the Arctic ground, we should be careful what we call endurance. Yes, they were still there. Yes, they had outlasted much of the world they once knew. But if the mainland system was already broken, if isolation had already narrowed the future, if harmful mutations were already building in that final remnant, then the end may have been approaching in silence long before anyone could have recognized it. And that brings us to a harder question than who killed them. What exactly does a species lose first? Its numbers, its habitat, its health, or its future? That question becomes even harder when we widen the frame again and look beyond the mammoths themselves. Because they did not vanish out of an otherwise healthy and stable world. In North America, during that long, dangerous interval near the Clovis era, other giants disappeared too. Mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats. And that fact matters more than it first appears. These were not copies of one another. They did not all eat the same food. They did not all move through the land in the same way. They did not all depend on the same exact habitat. So when many different large animals fade out in roughly the same age of upheaval, the mystery deepens. A single species can fail for very specific reasons. A whole community of giants slipping away points to something broader. So simple answers keep collapsing under their own weight. If you say climate alone, you still have to explain why different forms vanished in roughly the same era, yet not always in identical patterns. If you say hunting alone, you have to face the same problem from the other side. These animals lived different lives, and not all of them would have responded in the same way to the same pressure. If you reach for disease, you run into another limit. Disease may matter, perhaps even greatly in the wrong conditions, but by itself, it still struggles to explain such a wide and varied pattern without help from everything already changing around it. And that is the point. Help from everything already changing around it. Once the mammoth steppe broke apart and the old, cold grassland system started giving way, the entire stage changed for the giants, not just for one species. Some would have lost feeding ground. Some would have lost movement corridors. Some would have faced smaller and more isolated populations. Some would have met human pressure in a landscape that no longer gave them the same room to absorb it. The causes may not have landed equally, but they were no longer striking a stable world. This is why deep time catastrophe feels so unnerving. It is not always one perfect blow. It can be the same destabilized age, reaching many creatures through different weaknesses. One loses range first. Another loses numbers first. Another becomes more exposed to hunters. Another becomes more vulnerable once the ecological web around it starts thinning. The endings do not have to look identical for the larger crisis to be shared. So the disappearance of these giants begins to look less like a list of separate mysteries and more like one immense unraveling with many local expressions. And if that is true, then the most dangerous force in the story may not be climate or hunting or disease taken one by one. It may be the way each pressure made the others harder to survive. That compounding pressure is what turns a difficult environment into a true extinction machine. On their own, many stresses can be survived. A colder season here, a poorer feeding ground there, a drop in numbers that later recovers. Nature is full of living things that endure swings like that. But this story is darker because the pressures do not stay separate. They begin to cooperate. The warming at the end of the Ice Age changes the land. The land no longer supports the same wide movement. Smaller groups become more isolated. Once groups are smaller, any added hunting pressure hurts more. If disease played any role at all, smaller groups would have less room to absorb it. And when isolation lasts, the hidden genetic burden begins to rise. That is the trap, a sequence in which each new weakness makes the next one more dangerous. You can almost hear the logic closing around them. The grassland world narrows, the old routes fray. Recovery becomes harder. Then, whatever arrives next does not strike a strong, connected population. It strikes a fractured one. This is why catastrophe reconstruction matters here. If we tell the story as climate versus humans, we miss the mechanism. If we tell it as disease or no disease, we miss it again. The real horror may be that the system was losing flexibility from several directions at once. And a species that loses flexibility is already in trouble, even before the final bodies disappear from view. Think about the great animals of North America in that dangerous window near the Clovis era. Mammoths vanish, mastodons vanish, giant ground sloths vanish, saber-toothed cats vanish. Different creatures, yes, but all living through a world that was no longer stable in the old way. Some may have suffered first from habitat change. Some may have been hit harder by human pressure. Some may simply have had no safe margin once the ecological web around them began to loosen. The exact path need not be identical for the ending to belong to the same age of collapse. And that, I think, is what makes this mystery feel so ominous. The ending is not random. It is patterned, but not simple. You do not get one neat cause you can circle in red ink and call the case closed. You get a landscape changing underfoot, populations thinning, connections breaking, and then the last survivors carrying burdens that no healthy, expansive species should have to carry for long. By the time we reach the isolated survivors, the question is no longer whether pressure existed. The question is whether there was any path left out of it. Because if every escape route had already narrowed, climate, isolation, hunting, and perhaps disease all leaning in together, then the final remnant was not waiting for one last disaster. It was already living inside one. Once you start thinking in terms of closed escape routes, the final survivors stop looking like an exception to the rule and start looking like its last proof. That is the strange cruelty of delayed extinction. It can fool both the eye and the heart. If even a small herd is still alive somewhere, we instinctively treat that as hope. We imagine that life itself means possibility. But in deep time, that is not always true. Life can persist after the wider system that once protected it has already failed. A species can keep going in body while losing, one by one, the conditions that once made renewal possible. This is why the island story matters so much. Not because it cancels the mainland collapse, but because it reveals what collapse can look like when it is stretched out. The last herd did not need to be healthy in the old sense to remain present. It only needed to last. And lasting is not the same thing as recovering. That difference is everything. Think of the old mammoth steppe again, not as scenery, but as structure. Wide grassland meant movement. Movement meant connection. Connection meant exchange, resilience, and the chance for losses in one place to be balanced by strength in another. Once that vast, cold grassland gave way in many regions, the species did not just lose food. It lost circulation. The world became patchier, less forgiving, harder to cross in the old way. That kind of loss changes the meaning of every later pressure. Now the overkill hypothesis lands on thinner populations. Now disease, if it mattered at all, meets groups with less margin. Now isolation no longer feels temporary. It becomes the condition itself. And once isolation becomes the condition, time stops being a friend. We often imagine that survival for a long time must be a good sign. But for a remnant population, long duration in small numbers can be one of the worst things imaginable. It allows hidden weakness to accumulate. It turns survival into attrition. It gives the system more years to spend down what little resilience remains. So perhaps the real disaster was not a sudden ending at all. Perhaps it was the moment when the species entered a form of existence that still looked alive from the outside, but had already begun to consume its last reserves. In that sense, the final herd was already over the edge, just falling slowly enough that the world had time to mistake the descent for endurance. And if that is true, then one more unsettling possibility opens. Maybe the final question is not which force struck hardest. Maybe it is which force arrived first. The one that turned every later threat into something the mammoths could no longer fully resist. And if the first weakening force matters most, then we have to return once more to the land itself. Not because the answer is simple there, but because that is where the chain begins to tighten. Before hunting, before isolation became severe, before the last remnant carried obvious internal damage, there was the change in the world that held these animals up. The old grassland system changed character. Open country gave way in many places to tundra and forest as the glaciers retreated. That shift matters because these giants were not general-purpose creatures built for every kind of northern ground. They had flourished in a specific kind of space, broad, cold, grassy, connected. When that space started to break apart, it did something more dangerous than simple loss. It rearranged the rules. A herd that once moved through open feeding country now faced narrower options. A population that once belonged to a great connected range now risked becoming one local pocket among others. And once that happens, cause and effect stop behaving cleanly. Climate is no longer just climate. It becomes fragmentation. Fragmentation becomes vulnerability. Vulnerability changes the impact of everything that follows. This is why the old argument, climate or humans, can feel so misleading. It asks us to choose between two stages of the same disaster. If the warming world had not altered the structure of the habitat, perhaps human pressure would have landed differently. If people had not appeared in a changing world, perhaps some populations would still have endured longer or recovered better. But history did not offer those clean, separate trials. The forces arrived in the same age, crossed paths, and compounded each other. And then there is the most painful possibility of all. Once the system is weakened enough, even ordinary bad luck becomes more dangerous. A poor season, a local decline, a failed recovery that would once have been temporary. In a strong world, those things pass. In a damaged one, they linger. They stack. They begin to matter. That is why the final island chapter should not tempt us into false comfort. The Wrangel Island remnant herd was not living in the old world with one problem attached. It was living after the old world had already narrowed, after the species had already lost scale. after survival itself had become more conditional than it once was. By then, the difference between pressure and doom may have been getting very thin. So perhaps the first great blow was not the last visible one. Perhaps it was the moment the landscape stopped being a partner and became a filter, deciding which populations still had room to adapt and which ones would carry the rest of the story as a slow, narrowing burden. And if the land made that first cut, what then did human beings add to the wound? What people may have added to the wound is not simple spectacle, but pressure at exactly the wrong moment. That is the part many listeners resist at first, because we tend to imagine hunting in crude, oversized pictures. A vast wave of killing, an instant collapse, a clean villain. But the overkill hypothesis does not need that kind of drama to be unsettling. In fact, its darker strength lies in how little it may require. If the old grassland world was already thinning, if herds were already more scattered, if recovery was already slower than before, then even repeated losses at a modest level could matter far more than they would in a stable age. This is where timing becomes almost everything. A large, well-connected population can absorb damage and still recover. A fragmented one cannot do that so easily. And these animals were not built for quick replacement. They were giants from a world that had once given them room, food, distance, and continuity. Remove enough of that support, and the same pressure that would once have been survivable begins to bite deeper. Because the target has changed. It is no longer a strong, continuous population. It is a stressed one. That is why the human question stays so alive in this mystery. Not because it erases climate from the story, but because it may have entered exactly when climate had already made the living system more fragile. The land narrows, the routes shift, populations become patchier. Then a new pressure arrives, one capable of turning biological strain into lasting loss. You do not need one single catastrophic season. You only need enough repeated pressure to stop recovery from catching up. And that, I think, is what makes the idea so morally uncomfortable. Climate lets us keep the extinction at a distance, as something the planet did. Human hunting pulls the story much closer. It suggests that a species can survive enormous natural upheaval and still fail when one more force appears at the edge of its endurance, because timing can make ordinary pressure fatal. Still, we have to be careful. This is not proof that humans alone ended the mammoths. It is one part of a debated picture. The fact remains, scientists still argue over warming, hunting, disease, or some combination of them. But once you place human pressure inside a damaged world, the theory no longer feels exaggerated. It feels structurally possible. And that leaves us with a harder image than the old stories ever gave us. Not a healthy Ice Age kingdom struck down in one blow, but a weakened world, already losing its shape, meeting a new predator at the very moment it could least afford one. Which raises the next question. If climate made the species vulnerable, and human hunting may have deepened that vulnerability, then why did the final survivors still hold on for so long at all? That long holdout begins to make sense only when we stop treating survival as one solid thing. A species can survive in different ways. It can survive strongly, with room to grow, reconnect, and recover. Or it can survive narrowly, holding on in a pocket that still resembles the lost world just enough to delay the end. The final mammoths seem to belong to that second kind of survival. They were not proof that the wider collapse had failed. They were proof that small refuges can preserve life after the larger system has already broken. And that matters, because it explains why the last survivors could outlive the main age of disappearance by so much without disproving any of the pressures we've been talking about. Imagine a world after a storm. Most of the structure is gone, but a few corners still stand. You would not look at those corners and say the storm never happened. You would say they lasted longer. That is what the island remnant appears to have been, a surviving corner of a vanished ecological house. Enough cold, enough open ground, enough of the old conditions to support bodies for a while. Not enough to rebuild the full thing that had been lost. So the timeline feels so eerie. The pyramids could rise in Egypt while those last animals still moved across Arctic ground, and yet their world was already ancient by then. Ancient not in age alone, but in form. They belonged to a system whose great center had already collapsed. What remained was not a restored kingdom, it was a delayed afterlife. Once you see that, the apparent contradiction softens. Climate change can still matter deeply. Human hunting can still matter deeply. Disease can still remain possible. And the late remnant can still exist because refuges often preserve the last traces of a world after the main body has failed. Edge survival is not the same as health at the center. In fact, edge survival can be one of the clearest signs that the center is gone. That makes this whole story so unsettling. The animals endured enough to confuse the timeline, but not enough to reverse it. They lasted, but they did not recover. The refuge bought them years, centuries, even millennia, but not renewal. And once a lineage is living on borrowed conditions, time itself becomes ambiguous. It looks like mercy. It may only be extension. So the late survivors do not cancel the case against climate, or hunting, or compounding pressures. They sharpen it. Because if even their last refuge could only delay the end, then the real catastrophe was probably already complete in everything that mattered most: range, resilience, connection, and future. Which means we are now close to the hardest truth of all. The final disappearance may have been quiet precisely because the true extinction had begun much earlier. That earlier beginning is what makes the extinction so difficult for the mind to accept, because it asks us to separate presence from power. The last survivors held on for a long time, yes, but holding on and recovering are not the same act. A remnant can persist because one place still offers enough cold, enough open ground, enough food to support bodies for a while. That does not mean the species has regained what it lost. It may only mean one last fragment remains outside the main collapse, sheltered just enough to keep the story going a little longer. And that is why the island refuge matters so much in this reconstruction. It shows us how survival can become highly local, while failure has already become global for that species. The old connected world is gone. The large populations are gone. The broad exchange that once gave resilience is gone. Yet in one isolated pocket, life continues. To the listener, that sounds almost hopeful. To the deeper logic of extinction, it may be the opposite. It may be the final proof that the larger structure can no longer sustain itself. This is also why the debate between climate and hunting becomes less useful when treated as a contest with one winner. Climate may explain why the great living world began to break apart. Human pressure may explain why that weakened world struggled to regain its footing. Disease may still belong on the edge of the picture, not as a proven main cause, but as one more danger that becomes more serious in stressed and fragmented populations. None of these ideas cancels the others. They intensify one another. Once you accept that, the timeline stops feeling contradictory. Of course, some of them could survive long after the main age of losses. That is what refuges do. They delay endings. They preserve the last visible shape of a species after the deeper damage has already been done elsewhere. In that sense, the final herd was standing inside the extinction's longest echo. And maybe that is the most unsettling image of all. Not the giant in its prime on the open steppe, not the first pressure, not even the final quiet disappearance, but the long interval in between, when the species is still alive enough to be counted, yet no longer whole enough to truly return. So the extinction begins to look like a narrowing corridor. First, the landscape changes. Then, the populations thin. Then, the connections weaken. Then, the survivors become more isolated. Then, time itself turns against them. Because every extra generation in a reduced state increases the burden. By the end, the question is almost no longer, why did the last mammoths vanish? It becomes something colder. Once the corridor had narrowed that far, was there ever really a way back at all? That earlier beginning changes the emotional shape of the whole extinction, because it means the last scene was never the whole story. By the time the final herd remained in its Arctic refuge, the deepest losses may already have happened elsewhere. The loss of the last bodies, the loss of scale, movement, connection, recovery. Those are harder things to picture because they do not leave one dramatic image behind. They happen gradually. A route is no longer used. A feeding ground no longer supports the old numbers. A population becomes separate from another one, then smaller, then more fragile. None of that looks like extinction yet. And still, in a very real sense, extinction has already begun. This is why the last survivors can feel almost ghostly. They are still real animals, still alive, still moving through cold air and sparse ground. But they are carrying a history that has already narrowed around them. They are not the beginning of the puzzle. They are its aftersound. And that is what makes their survival so haunting. It was not meaningless. It was not false. But it belonged to a species already reduced to much thinner terms than before. Once you understand that, the different theories start to sit beside each other more naturally. The end Ice Age warming can explain why the world they were built for stopped behaving like home. Human hunting can explain why a weakened population might fail to recover. Disease can remain a possible added pressure without needing to carry the whole case by itself. And the later genetic burden in the remnant can explain why holding on for a long time did not equal regaining strength. Each explanation answers a different part of the same disaster. That is the key shift. We are no longer looking for one perfect bullet point that explains everything from first change to final disappearance. We are looking at a sequence. A system that first lost breadth, then resilience, then freedom of movement, then biological stability. By the end, the survivors may have been living inside consequences they could no longer reverse, no matter how much time remained on the clock. And that helps answer the question of why they lasted so long. They lasted because refuges can preserve life after the center has failed. They lasted because extinction in deep time can move unevenly. They lasted because the world does not always end everywhere at once. But that answer gives us no comfort, because if the final herd survived only as the last surviving edge of a broken system, then the real catastrophe was not delayed at all. It had already happened where it mattered most. Which leaves us standing before the coldest possibility in the whole reconstruction. The last mammoths may not have been waiting for extinction to arrive. They may have been living inside its final phase for generations already. And that final phase is where this ancient mystery stops feeling remote and starts feeling uncomfortably familiar. A species need not vanish overnight to be in real danger. It can still be present, still visible, still able to fool anyone who only counts bodies. But if its habitat has narrowed, if its populations are cut apart, if outside pressure keeps preventing recovery, and if time in isolation starts turning survival into weakness, then the living form may already be carrying the shape of its own ending. That is the lesson hidden inside this whole reconstruction. The giants of the Ice Age were not flimsy creatures. They had already endured immense swings in climate before the final chapter. That matters. It means we cannot dismiss them as fragile relics that simply folded at the first sign of change. They were survivors, which makes their disappearance even more revealing. If animals that large, that widespread, and that well-suited to their world could still be cornered by compounding pressures, then extinction is not only about weakness. It is about thresholds. Once enough thresholds are crossed, the system changes character. That makes the extinction of mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, and saber-toothed cats still matter now. Not because we expect the past to repeat itself in the same costume, but because the pattern is so clear once you finally see it. First, the world shifts. Then, ranges shrink. Then, populations fragment. Then, recovery stops keeping pace with loss. And when that happens, every additional stress becomes more dangerous than it would have been in a richer, wider, more connected world. This is not just a prehistoric curiosity. It is a warning written in deep time. The final herd on the island shows us the last visible stage, the small remnant, the reduced options, the possible genetic burden building in silence. But the broader disappearance across North America shows us the larger mechanism. Different giants, different lives, and yet one age of unraveling. That is what gives the story its force. It was not one unlucky species. It was a whole living order losing the conditions that had once made giants possible. And the most sobering part is this. The end may have looked quiet because the loudest part of the disaster had already happened earlier, in habitat, in numbers, in connection, in possibility. When the last survivors remained, the world may already have become too small for true return. So when we ask why they vanished, we are really asking how a living world crosses from strain into no way back. And if you frame it that way, one final line of the mystery comes into view. If the last survivors were already trapped inside a shrinking future, what does their fate reveal about the difference between being alive and being safe? And that difference between being alive and being safe may be the most important line in the entire story. A species may still occupy space without truly possessing a future. That sounds harsh, but the evidence keeps pointing us there. The late survivors did not disappear because life suddenly became impossible on a single day. They endured because one remote place still offered enough of the old conditions to keep them going. But endurance is not security. A narrow refuge can preserve bodies while failing to preserve resilience. And that is a much colder kind of survival than most people imagine. So we have to draw a clean line between fact and fantasy here. The facts we have are strong enough without turning them into myths. Mammoths lived long after most people assume. The old, cold grassland they thrived in changed as the Ice Age ended. In North America, several kinds of giant animals vanished within the same broad age. Scientists still debate the balance between warming, hunting, disease, and combined pressures. And the final island survivors carried signs of severe inbreeding and harmful mutations. That alone is already extraordinary. We do not need imaginary lost worlds or magical explanations. The real story is more unsettling, precisely because it is natural. Nature does not need drama to be merciless. It can reduce a species step by step, first by changing its home, then by shrinking its range, then by isolating its populations, then by making every outside pressure more costly. Then, in the final remnant, by letting time itself deepen the damage. Once you see that sequence clearly, the extinction stops looking like a puzzle with one missing piece. It starts looking like a system that was failing on several levels at once. And that brings us back to the emotional trap that has haunted this whole mystery. We want the last survivors to mean hope. We want to believe that if a creature is still there, somewhere, then rescue must still be possible. But in deep time, presence can be misleading. A living remnant can be the final visible sign of a catastrophe that has already crossed the point of repair. So the ending feels so quiet in our imagination. By the time the last herd remained, the loud part of the disaster may already have passed, not as noise, but as lost connection, lost numbers, lost adaptability. The visible end was only the moment when even the delayed refuge could no longer carry what the larger world had already stopped supporting. So before we close this case, one final question remains hanging in the cold air. If the real extinction began long before the last mammoth vanished, then what exactly was the last herd telling us about survival all along? What that last herd was telling us, I think, is something both simple and brutal. Survival can continue long after recovery has ended. That is the deep time lesson hidden inside this story. We tend to treat extinction as a visible event, something obvious, something you would recognize if you stood close enough. But these giants challenge that instinct. The final survivors suggest that a species can remain on the landscape while the real machinery that once supported it has already broken down. It can still move, still feed, still leave tracks in cold dust or frozen soil, and still be living on borrowed terms. That is why the remnant on the island feels so haunting in retrospect. It was the last chapter and a kind of message, a warning from the far end of a process we usually notice too late. The old world had already contracted. The mammoth steppe was no longer the vast connected system it had been. North America had already seen its great thinning of giants in that broad window near the Clovis era. The debate over climate, hunting, disease, or some combination of them still matters, yes, but by the time the final survivors remained, the question may already have changed from what pressure is acting to what options are left. And that is a much colder question. Because once options vanish, survival stops being freedom. It becomes management of decline. A refuge helps, but only within limits. Time helps, but only for a while. Even isolation, which can shield a remnant from some dangers, can deepen others. That is how the island turns from a sanctuary into something almost tragic in shape. It preserves the final bodies, but it cannot restore the lost world behind them. So the last herd was not lying to us. It really was surviving, but it was surviving in a way that exposed the truth of the larger extinction rather than disproved it. It showed us that the end of a species can be stretched out, quiet, and deceptive, not because the danger was small, but because the danger had moved inward, into numbers, into separation, into time itself. If you listen carefully, that is the final warning carried by these animals before they were gone. Do not confuse persistence with safety. Do not confuse presence with strength. And above all, do not assume that a living remnant means the system beneath it is still healthy. Because once that illusion falls away, only one question remains for us to face in the very last step of this story. When we strip away the myths and the false comfort, what does the fate of the mammoths finally reveal about us and about the kind of world that keeps species alive? So here, at the end, the mystery resolves without becoming small. The last mammoths did outlive the building of the Great Pyramid of Giza. That strange fact remains true, and it remains powerful. But it does not mean they escaped the old catastrophe. It means the catastrophe was longer, quieter, and more uneven than our instincts like to admit. The warming at the end of the Ice Age changed the world that had once carried them. In North America, giants disappeared across the same broad age of loss. Human hunting may have pressed hardest when recovery was already weakening. Disease may have mattered at the edges. And in the island survivors, the inward cost became visible. Severe inbreeding, harmful mutations, the slow inward collapse of a population with too few paths left. So the real answer is not a single villain standing alone in the snow. It is convergence. A grassland world narrows. Populations lose contact. Numbers fall. Pressure from outside hurts more. Time in isolation stops healing and starts eroding. When the last herd remains, extinction is not an approaching storm. It is the weather they are already breathing. And that, I think, is the truest reconstruction we can make from what remains. Not a fairy tale of mysterious giants suddenly gone, and not a neat courtroom verdict with one guilty party. What happened to woolly mammoths and the extinction of Ice Age megafauna was harsher than that. Because it was ordinary in the most frightening way. A world changed. The margins shrank. The living system lost its ability to recover. Then even survival became a trap. If there is a final image to carry from this, let it be this one. Cold wind moving over an island after the main grassland world is already gone, and tracks in the thin ground leading nowhere beyond the shore. The feet are still there. The bodies are still there. But the road that made a future has already disappeared. That is the wisdom these giants leave behind. Life does not end only when the last creature falls silent. Sometimes it begins ending when the map grows too small for return. The air goes still after that. No trumpet, no grand curtain. Just exposed ground, gray light, and a horizon that no longer opens. And somewhere far to the south, stone monuments keep standing, while the last prints at the Arctic edge fill slowly with frost. If this journey gave you a new way to see deep time, stay with the channel. And if one part of this story stayed with you, leave a comment. I genuinely like to know which one.